My name is Renata Voss. I am 38 years old, and I'm holding a serving spoon right now, stainless steel, 12 inches long, with a slight bend in the handle where someone gripped it too hard and never bothered to straighten it. Because this spoon is the reason I lost my marriage, found a crime, and walked my two children out of the only home they had ever known on a Sunday evening in October, while the roast I had spent 4 hours preparing was still warm on the table. The spoon was part of a set. A 12-piece Hostess collection, retail value $412, purchased by my mother-in-law Cordelia Pratt as a wedding gift 14 years ago. She presented it to us in a velvet-lined case at the rehearsal dinner with a toast that sounded generous to everyone in the room except me. "Every good kitchen needs proper tools," she said, smiling at the guests. "And every new wife needs reminding that the family she's joining has standards worth rising to." I held the case in both hands and smiled. My fingers had already found the bend in the handle of the largest spoon, a manufacturing flaw so slight most people would never notice it. I noticed because noticing flaws in materials is what I do for a living, and what I have done every working day for 16 years. I am a metallurgical failure analyst. I spend my days examining why things break: bridge cables, aircraft fasteners, surgical implants, pipeline welds. I receive a component that failed under stress, and I determine whether the failure was caused by fatigue, corrosion, manufacturing defect, or deliberate interference. I section the material. I examine the grain structure under magnification. I read the fracture surface the way other people read handwriting, because every crack tells you exactly where the weakness began and how long it was ignored before catastrophe. That skill had exposed hidden flaws in components trusted by engineers, surgeons, and safety boards for 16 years. It was about to expose a hidden flaw in my own family. Before I tell you what I did, the night I decided to examine this spoon more closely than anyone ever expected me to. Where are you right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to know where this reaches. The bend in the handle bothered me the first time I held it. Not emotionally, structurally. A spoon marketed as 1810 stainless steel should not deform under normal grip pressure. The alloy composition was wrong, or the heat treatment was insufficient, or the piece was not what it claimed to be. I stood in my new kitchen that first week of marriage, turning the spoon under the light, and something in me went perfectly still. I held it there, thumb pressed into the bend, reading the deformation pattern the way I would read a stress fracture on a submitted sample. My breathing slowed. My vision narrowed to the grain distortion visible along the curve. I was already running a material assessment I hadn't consciously initiated. But I set it down. I put it back in the velvet case. I told myself it was a wedding gift, not a work sample, and that not everything in my life needed to be tested to failure. I wish I had listened to the spoon that first week. It was already telling me everything I needed to know about the family I had married into. I met Dean Pratt when I was 23, fresh out of my master's program in materials science, working my first real position at an independent testing laboratory outside of Richmond. He was a client's project manager, overseeing a commercial renovation that required weld certification on structural steel. He brought samples to our lab on a Tuesday afternoon, stayed 40 minutes past his appointment asking questions about the testing process, and called me the following evening to ask whether I might want to explain grain boundary diffusion to him over dinner sometime. I said yes before he finished the sentence. He had a warmth that made rooms feel smaller in a good way, like the walls had drawn in just to hold the conversation. He remembered things I mentioned once and brought them back weeks later as though they mattered. He carried tools in his truck even on weekends. He built a bookshelf for my apartment without being asked, and when I told him it was slightly out of plumb, he tore it down and rebuilt it without complaint. That was the man I married. The man who listened to corrections because he understood that precision was how I showed love. Cordelia and her daughter, Dean's older sister Margot, operated differently. Cordelia had raised her children alone after Dean's father left when Dean was 9, and she had constructed from that abandonment an entire philosophy of family governance that placed herself permanently at the center of every decision. She controlled holidays, she controlled seating arrangements, she controlled who spoke first at meals and who served whom, and in what order. None of this was written down. It didn't need to be. It was enforced through a system of small corrections delivered so casually that objecting to any single one would make you sound unhinged. Margot was the enforcer. 3 years older than Dean, unmarried, living in a duplex Cordelia owned outright, managing the books for Cordelia's small chain of regional dry cleaning locations. Margot had a way of delivering instructions disguised as observations. "Oh, Renata, we usually let Mom sit first." "Oh, Renata, Dean's plate goes before the children's, that's just how we do things." "Oh, Renata, you might want to ask before you rearrange the serving dishes, Mom has a system." I absorbed these corrections for years because Dean asked me to with his eyes, if not his words. Every time I stiffened at something Margot said, he would place his hand briefly on my knee under the table, a gesture that felt like solidarity the first 50 times, and like a muzzle by the 100th. The irony is that I spent every working day identifying the exact point where a material's tolerance was exceeded and failure became inevitable. I could pinpoint the origin of a crack in a titanium rod down to the micron. But I couldn't see that my own tolerance had been eroding for 14 years under cyclical stress loading that any first-year student would have flagged as catastrophic on a graph. My daughter Nomi was 11 by the time of the dinner. My son Rennick was 7. I had built a career that other analysts in my field quietly respected, published papers, expert witness testimony in 2 product liability cases, a consulting contract with a regional hospital network that trusted me to evaluate failed surgical instruments before they trusted the manufacturer's own report. My income had exceeded Dean's for the past 6 years. I never mentioned it. Dean never acknowledged it. Cordelia, however, tracked it with a precision that suggested she had access to information I hadn't voluntarily shared. There were sacrifices along the way that I cataloged without meaning to, because cataloging is what my brain does, whether I ask it to or not. The year I turned down a keynote invitation at a national conference because it fell on Cordelia's birthday weekend, and Dean said his mother would never forgive the absence. The consulting opportunity in Munich I declined because Margot told Dean it was selfish for a mother of 2 small children to travel internationally for work when her family needed her at home. The laboratory expansion I had been planning for 3 years, delayed twice because Dean redirected funds from our joint savings to cover shortfalls in Cordelia's dry cleaning operation, temporary loans he called them, that were never repaid and never discussed again. Each sacrifice was small enough to survive. Together, they formed a load pattern I would have flagged immediately in any submitted test report. Cyclical stress, with no recovery interval, applied to a material that had never been rated for that kind of sustained demand. The October dinner was supposed to be simple. Dean's birthday. I offered to host. Cordelia accepted with the specific enthusiasm of a woman who prefers to be entertained in a home she considers partly hers. Margot arrived 25 minutes late and walked directly to the kitchen to inspect what I had prepared, opening pot lids and examining the roast as though conducting an inventory. I had cooked for 6 hours. A bone-in prime rib roast at $14 a pound, roasted potatoes with garlic and thyme, a beet salad Nomi helped me assemble, and a lemon cake Rennick had frosted with the earnest, uneven hand of a 7-year-old who took the project seriously. I set the table with the good linen. I used Cordelia's serving set, including the spoon, because Dean once mentioned his mother noticed when I didn't. When the food was ready, I served the children first, Nomi, then Rennick. Then I placed food on my own plate and sat down. I had not yet lifted my fork when Margot's open hand connected with the side of my face. The sound was louder than the pain. A flat, sharp crack that silenced the table entirely. Rennick's water glass tipped. Nomi's hands went flat against the tablecloth as though bracing for an earthquake. "You don't serve yourself before Mom," Margot said, not shouting, not even particularly angry. She said it with the tone of someone correcting a clerical error, routine, expected, barely worth the effort of raising her hand. I looked at Dean. He was holding his napkin in both hands, staring at the centerpiece. His jaw was working slightly, the way it always did when he was calculating the cost of speaking versus the cost of silence and choosing, as he always chose, the option that kept his mother's household in equilibrium. I did not speak. I set the spoon down, the same spoon, the one with the bend in the handle, and I placed both hands flat on the table. Something in me became perfectly still, not calm, still. The way a fracture surface looks under magnification when the crack has finally propagated through the last remaining cross-section and the material has simply let go. My breathing changed, my vision sharpened on the spoon lying against the white linen. I was reading the room the way I read a failed component, identifying the point of origin, the direction of crack propagation, the load that had been applied, and the design flaw that had made failure inevitable from the very beginning. I picked up the spoon. I examined the bend in its handle one more time. Then I stood, collected both of my children by their hands, and walked out of that dining room without saying a single word to anyone at the table. I drove to my parents' house, 37 minutes away. My mother opened the door, looked at the mark on my face, and pulled all three of us inside without asking a question. Nomi cried that night. Rennick asked if we were coming back for the cake he had frosted. I told him we would have cake, but not there, not at that table, not ever again. I filed for divorce 9 days later. My attorney was a woman named Clarice Okafor, recommended by the hospital network I consulted for, who had handled complex marital fraud cases for over 20 years. She listened to my account across 2 meetings without interrupting, then asked me one question I did not expect. Is there anything financial that doesn't add up? I told her about the temporary loans to Cordelia's business. She asked for amounts and dates. I gave her what I could remember. She subpoenaed the rest within the week. The joint account records showed what I had already suspected but never quantified. Over the past 7 years, $111,000 had moved from our household account to an account held in Margot's name, not Cordelia's. The transfers were structured in amounts between $800 and $2,000, spaced irregularly, and labeled in our banking app with descriptions Dean had typed himself: utilities, insurance adjustment, property maintenance. None of them were any of those things. That was layer 1, the obvious insult, the surface math. But I am a failure analyst, and I have learned that the surface fracture is never the origin. I began examining the spoon, not metaphorically. I brought it to my laboratory on a Monday morning, sectioned a small sample from the handle near the deformation point, and mounted it for metallographic analysis. The alloy was not 1810 stainless steel. It was a lower-grade ferritic steel, with a nickel content roughly 1/3 of what the manufacturer's stamp claimed. The spoon set Cordelia had presented as a $400 wedding gift was worth perhaps $40 retail. The velvet case was worth more than its contents. I pulled the original receipt from the wedding gift registry, still archived in my email, and cross-referenced the SQ with the manufacturer's catalog. The SQ on Cordelia's receipt matched a premium line. But the spoon's actual composition matched a budget line sold under a different brand name through discount retailers. Someone had purchased the cheap set and presented it in packaging from the expensive one. The receipt itself, when I examined the PDF metadata, showed an author field registered to a computer named Margot XP and a creation date 11 days before our wedding. The receipt was fabricated, the gift was a performance, and the document that proved it had been created on Margot's personal computer. Clarice found the second thread by pulling Cordelia's dry cleaning business records as part of the financial discovery. The business had been operating at a loss for 5 of the past 7 years. During the same period, Margot, listed as bookkeeper, had been issuing invoices to the business from a sole proprietorship registered in her own name for consulting services that generated between $9,000 and $14,000 annually. The sole proprietorship had no clients other than her mother's company, no website, no tax filings for 3 of those years. The money flowing from our joint account to Margot's personal account was not supporting a struggling family business. It was funding a shell arrangement designed to move money from my earnings, through Dean, through Cordelia's books, and into Margot's personal finances, with no traceable obligation to return it. I sat in Clarice's office the afternoon she laid this out, holding the sectioned spoon sample in a small evidence bag on my lap. I stared at the fracture surface, visible through the plastic. Something in me was running calculations I hadn't requested, not about money, but about time. 14 years of meals I had cooked and served in the wrong order. 14 years of corrections I had absorbed without resistance. 14 years of funding a family structure that had been extracting from me since the day I accepted a $40 spoon in a $400 box and called it generosity. Clarice found the third layer in county property records. 4 years before our wedding, Cordelia had attempted to add Margot's name to the deed of a property co-owned with Cordelia's own sister, using a power of attorney document the sister later contested in a civil filing that was settled privately and sealed. The pattern was not new. It had simply found a new target when Dean married someone with income worth redirecting. The fourth layer came from the spoon itself, or rather from where it led. The fabricated receipt's metadata included an embedded printer serial number. Clarice's forensic technology consultant traced that serial number to a printer purchased by Margot 18 months before our wedding, the same printer that had produced a falsified insurance document submitted during the property dispute with Cordelia's sister. The same device, the same operator, the same method adapted across decades and applied to whichever family member currently held assets worth appropriating. The confrontation happened in Cordelia's living room, the room she had decorated with photographs of her children and grandchildren arranged in a hierarchy that placed her own image at the center of every wall. She had called a family meeting to discuss, as she put it, Renata's behavior and what it's doing to this family. She expected me to arrive apologetic or absent. I arrived with Clarice, a file folder, and the spoon in a clear evidence bag. Cordelia sat in her wingback chair, the one no one else was permitted to use, positioned beneath a framed portrait of herself at 50 that Margot had commissioned as a birthday gift. Margot stood behind her. Dean sat on the sofa, already folded into himself. "This has gone far enough," Cordelia said, adjusting her reading glasses as though she were about to review a disappointing report card. "You've upset the entire family over a misunderstanding at dinner. Margot shouldn't have raised her hand, we all agree on that. But you left without a word. You took the children, you filed papers. This is not how adults in this family handle disagreements." I said nothing. Clarice opened the file folder. "That's not necessary," Margot said quickly. "This is a family conversation, not a legal proceeding." Clarice placed the first document on Cordelia's coffee table. The bank transfer records. 7 years, $111,000. "Those were loans," Dean said from the sofa. "I told you, they were going to pay it back." Clarice placed the second document. Margot's Shell Consulting invoices, the sole proprietorship with no clients, no filings, no evidence of any services rendered. "That's my business," Margot said. "You have no right to." "After everything I have done for this family," Cordelia interrupted, her voice climbing for the first time, "after everything I sacrificed to raise these children alone, you come into my home with paperwork, as though money is what this family is about." "This is harassment," Margot said. "She's doing this because she's bitter about the marriage. She's always resented us. Dean, tell them." Dean looked at the documents on the table. He did not speak. His jaw was working again. Clarice placed the third document, the forged receipt, the metadata report, the printer serial number, the connection to the property dispute with Cordelia's own sister. The room went quiet. Cordelia's hand, resting on the arm of her wingback chair, had gone white at the knuckles. Margot took one step backward, toward the hallway, as though proximity to the coffee table had become physically dangerous. Then I placed the spoon on the table, still in its evidence bag, the bend in the handle visible through the clear plastic. "This spoon," I said, "is $40 ferritic steel stamped to look like a $400 alloy. The receipt that came with it was printed on your computer, Margot, from a template, 11 days before my wedding." No one in the room moved. Cordelia stared at the spoon, as though it had materialized from a dimension she hadn't known existed. I said one more thing, only one. "You handed me a fake gift in a real box and spent 14 years making sure I never looked closely enough to know the difference." Then I sat back. I did not elaborate. The silence lasted long enough for the refrigerator's compressor to cycle on in the kitchen. Cordelia opened her mouth, closed it, and then turned to Margot with an expression I had never seen on her face before, not anger, not shame, but the sudden raw awareness of a person realizing the room they built might not hold. It was Clarice who spoke next, but not on my behalf. She introduced a notarized statement from a woman named Priya Alden, the notary public who had processed the property document in the dispute with Cordelia's sister. Priya had been contacted during Clarice's investigation and had provided a sworn declaration that she had been told the power of attorney was legitimate and had no reason to question it at the time, but that she had kept her own contemporaneous notes expressing concern about the circumstances. Those notes, preserved for over 18 years, corroborated a pattern of document fabrication that predated my involvement with the family by more than a decade. Margot asked to leave the room. Cordelia told her to sit down. It was the first time I had ever seen Cordelia give Margot an order that Margot did not want to obey. Dean on the sofa said quietly, "I didn't know about the spoon," as though the spoon were the issue. As though the spoon were not simply the smallest visible symptom of a structural failure that had been propagating through this family for longer than I had been alive. The consequences arrived the way consequences do when the underlying structure has finally been exposed. Not as a single dramatic collapse, but as a series of sequential failures, each one loading the next. Clarice referred the financial documentation to the district attorney's office, which opened a preliminary investigation into the shell invoicing arrangement and the fabricated receipt. Margot retained her own attorney within 48 hours. Cordelia, who had spent decades positioning herself as the family's moral center, found herself named in a civil fraud complaint filed on behalf of her own sister, who had learned through mutual family contacts that the same pattern used against her had resurfaced in a new marriage. The sister, who had stayed silent for 18 years, retained counsel and reopened the settled property dispute. Margot's sole proprietorship was dissolved by the state after the tax filings Clarice flagged prompted a review. The dry cleaning operation, already unprofitable, lost its remaining commercial lease within 4 months when the landlord, reviewing the business's financials during a routine renewal, declined to extend the agreement. Dean moved into Cordelia's house the week after our separation was formalized. He called me twice in the following month, not to apologize, but to ask whether I would consider mediation rather than litigation. Clarice advised against it. I agreed with Clarice. There was nothing left to mediate. There was only math, and the math had been running against me for 14 years. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in March. I received primary custody of both children, the house, fully in my name, and a restitution order requiring repayment of the documented transfers over a structured timeline. Dean agreed to the terms without contesting them. I do not know whether that represented remorse or merely the recognition that contesting them would have required Cordelia and Margot to provide testimony under oath about financial arrangements none of them wanted examined further. Dean's cousin, a quiet man named Soren, who had attended every family gathering for years without ever speaking more than a handful of words, sent me a message 3 weeks after the proceedings concluded. It was short. I watched it happen for years and said nothing. I should have. I'm sorry. He had been present at the dinner when Margot struck me. He had been present at dozens of earlier dinners where corrections were issued and silence was maintained. His apology was sincere. It was also the precise shape of the problem. A decent person who had witnessed a pattern and chosen, year after year, the comfort of not intervening. I thanked him. I did not tell him it was all right, because it wasn't, and pretending otherwise would have been one more accommodation in a lifetime of them. Soren began attending Nomi's school events the following autumn, showing up without announcement, sitting in the back row. He never asked for forgiveness again. He simply started being present in a way he hadn't been before. It was not enough to repair what had been lost, but it was real, and I noticed it, and I let it exist without needing to name what it meant. Nomi asked me once, sitting on the kitchen counter while I cooked, why Grandma Cordelia didn't come over anymore. I told her that sometimes people who are supposed to take care of a family forget that taking care means making sure everyone at the table feels safe, not just the people who arrived first. She thought about it for a long time and then said, "So it's like when someone cuts in line and gets mad when you don't let them." I told her that was exactly what it was like. Rennick adjusted faster than any of us. He claimed his new bedroom within a week and filled it with the same chaos of drawings and half-assembled models that had always surrounded him. He asked about Dean on weekends and accepted the structured visits without complaint. He never asked about Margot. He never asked about the spoon. The laboratory expansion I had postponed twice went forward in the spring. I signed the lease on a second testing facility, 1,200 square feet, better equipment, room for 2 additional analysts. The contract with the hospital network expanded to include 3 new facilities. The keynote invitation I had declined years earlier was reissued by the conference organizers for the following autumn. I accepted it without consulting anyone. I keep the spoon on my desk at the new laboratory, not in a drawer. On the surface, next to my microscope, where I can see it while I work. It sits there the way evidence sits in a case file, not as a reminder of what was done to me, but as a record of what I am trained to see when I finally allow myself to look. Last Tuesday evening, Nomi and Rennick and I sat down to dinner together in our kitchen. Nothing elaborate. Pasta with red sauce, bread Rennick tore apart with his hands instead of slicing. I served myself first. I used a wooden spoon from a set I bought myself, $9, honest pine, no manufacturing stamp, no velvet case. The handle is straight. It is exactly what it claims to be. I have spent my career studying why things fail. The answer is almost never a single catastrophic event. It is almost always a flaw present from the beginning, a weakness in the original material, an invisible defect introduced during fabrication that was subjected to repeated stress over time until the remaining cross-section could no longer hold. The failure looks sudden. It never is. It was always there, waiting for the last cycle of load that the structure could not absorb. What I have learned from my own fracture is simpler than any report I have ever written. Loyalty that requires you to absorb damage without complaint is not loyalty. It is a load-bearing arrangement in which one person carries the stress and another person benefits from the structure's apparent stability. When the person carrying the load finally fails, the ones who benefited will call it betrayal. They will say the structure was sound. They will blame the material. They will never once examine the design. Is there something sitting in a drawer somewhere in your home that you have been calling ordinary? A gift, a document, an object from a person you trusted, because examining it closely would require you to ask questions you are not sure you want answered.